HOA Karen called cops on my wife for ignoring the door. Too bad she's in charge of the entire pollock. You ever think you've seen it all? Until an HOA Karen decides to flex her so-called power on the wrong family? My wife was just minding her own business at home when Karen showed up pounding on our door. My wife ignored her. Because frankly, who has time for her nonsense? That's when Karen did the unthinkable. She called the cops. But here's the twist Karen didn't see coming. The woman she was trying to report was actually in charge of the entire police department. And what happened next? Well, let's just say Karen's smug smile didn't last long. Karen had always been the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, the type of person who thought a clipboard and a smug look gave her authority over every homeowner within a mile radius. From the moment we moved in, she made it her personal mission to monitor everything we did, from how tall our grass grew to the color of the flowers planted in our front yard. It was like she believed the HOA rules were etched into stone tablets delivered straight from above, and she was the one chosen to enforce them. She strutted around the block as if she were on official business, constantly snapping photos, scribbling notes, and sending out passive-aggressive emails about violations nobody else seemed to care about. It wasn't just us she targeted. No one in the neighborhood was safe from her constant surveillance. If a neighbor's car was parked too close to the curb, she'd document it. If a child left their bike lying on the lawn, she'd take a picture and demand immediate action. She was always hovering, always watching, as though she had nothing better to do with her time. But for some reason, she seemed especially fixated on our household. Maybe it was because we didn't bow down to her every whim, or maybe it was because my wife wasn't afraid to stand her ground when Karen came knocking with one of her ridiculous demands. Whatever the reason, Karen had made us her prime target, and it was clear she thrived on the idea of breaking us into submission. She loved to hold her little HOA meetings, which often turned into lectures more than discussions. Sitting at the head of the table, she'd wag her finger like a teacher scolding a room full of unruly children, rattling off a list of concerns, as though the world would collapse if someone left their trash bin out for more than 30 minutes. And if someone dared to question her authority, she had a way of twisting the rules to make them seem guilty, even when they weren't. She had this talent for inflating minor inconveniences into massive community crises, creating drama where none existed. It wasn't about protecting the neighborhood. It was about control. The funny thing was, she always cloaked her obsession in this fake concern for the good of the community. She'd say things like, "We all need to do our part to keep the neighborhood respectable," or, "I'm only enforcing the rules so everyone benefits." But behind those words was a thinly veiled desire to be in charge, to have the final say on everything, to make herself feel important. It wasn't about the rules, it was about power. And the more people resisted her, the more desperate she became to tighten her grip. What she didn't realize, though, was that the very people she tried to control were starting to grow tired of her antics. Neighbors who once nodded politely at her demands began to roll their eyes when she came around. Families started ignoring her emails, treating them as spam rather than urgent notices. People whispered at block parties about how exhausting she was, how she took the joy out of living in what should have been a peaceful community. The more she pushed, the more she isolated herself, yet she was too blinded by her self-righteousness to see it. And through it all, Karen kept circling back to us, determined to catch us slipping, convinced that if she could just find one major violation, she'd finally put us in our place. She would slow her car down in front of our house, peering over the steering wheel as though she were patrolling enemy territory. She'd show up uninvited, banging on the door with her signature impatient knock that always carried a note of hostility. And when we didn't answer, she'd leave little notes tucked into the doorframe, each one more passive-aggressive than the last. It got to the point where we could practically predict her next move. If we trimmed the hedges, she'd complain they weren't even enough. If we painted the fence, she'd claim the color was non-compliant. If we hosted a barbecue, she'd accuse us of being too loud, even if the music was barely audible. She thrived on the idea that she had us under her thumb, always waiting for the moment she could escalate things further. Little did she know, the game she was playing was about to take a turn she never could have imagined. That morning was like any other. The sun peeked through the blinds, the coffee pot bubbled in the kitchen, and the distant hum of suburban life drifted in through the open window. My wife had just come off a 12-hour night shift, drained but calm, still in her department-issued shirt, sipping black coffee while scrolling through her phone at the dining table. She wasn't in the mood for small talk, let alone a confrontation with someone like Karen. But of course, as if summoned by some invisible force of neighborhood nonsense, Karen came marching up the walkway like she owned the property. She had that walk, arms stiff, lips pursed, posture military, ready to unload whatever petty issue she had concocted that day. She didn't even bother to ring the doorbell at first. Instead, she started knocking aggressively on the door, a rhythm that screamed entitlement and impatience. Knock, knock, knock. Pause. Then louder, as if she believed that just because she was annoyed, the world had to obey her tempo. Inside, my wife simply glanced toward the sound, then went back to her phone, unbothered. She knew better than to engage. Karen wasn't looking for a conversation. She was hunting for a reaction, something she could twist and escalate, and my wife wasn't about to give her that satisfaction. So she ignored her, completely. No flinching, no peeking through the blinds, not even a sigh of acknowledgement. Karen wasn't used to being ignored. Most of the neighbors, even if reluctantly, answered the door when she showed up. They feared the follow-up emails, the citations, the awkward looks during HOA meetings. But my wife, she didn't care for the politics of Karen's little kingdom. She had handled far worse in her professional life: hostage situations, domestic disputes, gang standoffs. A pushy HOA Karen wasn't even a blip on her radar. Her silence, however, seemed to enrage Karen more than any insult could have. It was like being invisible to someone who demands to be the center of every room they enter. Outside, the knocking turned to shouting. "I saw the recycling bin was out last night. That's against HOA guidelines. You need to answer your door." Karen's voice was sharp, trying to cut through the calm like a dull blade. Still no response. My wife continued sipping her coffee, cool as ice, letting Karen's shrillness bounce off the walls like background noise. Karen tried knocking again, this time with her cell phone in hand, recording herself as she shouted into the camera about noncompliance, disrespect, and documented harassment because, in her world, not opening the door to her meant you were waging some kind of personal war. She circled the house, trying to find a window to peer into, raising her phone like a weapon of righteousness. She even yelled, "I'm giving you one more chance before I escalate this." But inside, there was no movement, just the clink of a spoon against a coffee mug and the occasional swipe of a finger across a screen. Karen finally stormed back to her car, breathing heavily, her expression twisted with a mix of indignation and glee. To her, this was a victory, a chance to enforce her twisted version of order. And she did exactly what anyone with her sense of self-importance and fragile ego would do. She called the police. She called them not because there was a threat, or a crime, or even a valid concern, but because her pride had been bruised. She wanted the weight of a badge and a gun to back up her authority. She believed the cops would knock the door down, demand answers, maybe even issue a citation on the spot. She imagined herself standing triumphantly beside them, arms crossed, smirking at my wife being put in her place. The thing about people like Karen is they live in a world fueled by their own delusions. She thought she was a protagonist in some neighborhood soap opera where everyone else was a supporting character meant to comply or be corrected. And as she gave the dispatcher her version of events, completely exaggerated, no doubt, she had no idea what was about to unfold. She didn't know that the very woman she was trying to get in trouble wasn't just a civilian. She wasn't just someone with a job and a house and a mortgage. She was the chief. She was the person that local officers reported to. She was the one who signed off on every major operational decision in the entire precinct. Karen, blinded by her inflated sense of self-importance, had just called the cops on their boss. Karen stood on the curb, pacing back and forth with her phone pressed tightly against her ear, speaking loudly enough for half the block to hear. She wanted an audience, as always. Her voice carried that shrill combination of faux authority and desperation, rattling off an exaggerated version of what just happened. "Yes, officer. I'm at 1128 Maple Drive. I've been trying to get in contact with the homeowner for 30 minutes now, and she's refusing to answer the door. This is blatant non-compliance with HOA regulations, and she's becoming aggressive by ignoring me. I feel unsafe, and I need someone here immediately. The audacity of calling 911 over being ignored was astounding, but in Karen's mind, silence equated to a personal attack. Inside, my wife set her coffee mug down, not because she was worried, but because she knew exactly how this was about to unfold. She leaned back in her chair with that look she always had when she could see a storm forming long before anyone else could. She didn't need to peek out the window to know Karen's every move. The louder Karen got, the more predictable she became. It was a script she had seen before in countless different forms, from entitled complaints to overblown emergencies. And my wife knew the cops would come, because when someone like Karen calls, they don't just report, they perform. Within minutes, the sound of sirens broke the calm of the street, though they cut off quickly as the patrol car pulled up in front of our house. Karen's chest puffed up like she had summoned the cavalry. She pointed to the house dramatically, giving a quick rundown before the officers even had a chance to step out of the car. That's the one. She won't answer the door. She's violating HOA rules. She was cut off as one of the officers held up his hand to calm her down. But Karen wasn't about to lose her momentum. She kept rattling on about bins left out too long, improper landscaping, noise complaints, and a laundry list of other fabricated grievances that no reasonable person would ever consider criminal. The officers exchanged a quick glance, one of them clearly trying not to roll his eyes. They had probably been on calls like this before, dragged into disputes that had no real legal standing, forced to play mediator in a situation that was nothing more than one person's hunger for control. Still, they had a job to do. They knocked on the door politely, far gentler than Karen had minutes earlier. Inside, my wife rose from her chair with a calmness that could only come from years of command experience. She smoothed the wrinkles from her shirt, checked her badge clipped at her side, and walked to the door without hesitation. Karen, standing just off to the side, was practically bouncing on her toes, waiting for the moment she could watch my wife get scolded, fined, or maybe even taken down a peg. Her eyes gleamed with a mixture of anticipation and smug victory. But when the door swung open and my wife stepped out, the entire script Karen had rehearsed in her head shattered instantly. The officers straightened up, their demeanor shifting from casual to formal in a heartbeat. "Chief," one of them said immediately, nodding with respect. "We didn't expect." He trailed off, clearly realizing the absurdity of the situation as he glanced from my wife to the furious, red-faced woman beside him. Karen froze, blinking rapidly, her mouth slightly open as if the air had been knocked out of her. "Chief?" she repeated, the word cracking like glass in her throat. She looked from one officer to the other, then back at my wife, confusion and disbelief painting her expression. She had no idea who she had just called the police on, and the realization was beginning to hit her like a slow-moving train. My wife crossed her arms, calm and composed, letting the silence do the work. The officers waited for her cue, their posture attentive, their respect evident. Meanwhile, Karen fumbled for words, trying to regain some semblance of control over the disaster she had just created. She wasn't answering the door. "I told you she was being uncooperative. That's why Her voice wavered, the confidence she had carried only minutes ago slipping away with every passing second. The officers didn't even glance her way. Their eyes stayed on my wife, waiting for her to speak, waiting for her to decide how this situation was going to end. And in that moment, Karen realized the power dynamic she had so desperately tried to control had flipped completely out of her hands. She had thought she was calling in backup to enforce her will. Instead, she had summoned an audience to watch her own humiliation unfold. The second the officers addressed my wife as chief, the entire tone of the scene shifted, and you could almost feel the air being sucked right out of Karen's lungs. She had been so sure this would be her moment of triumph, the grand unveiling of her so-called authority over the block. But instead she was standing there, eyes wide, watching the very people she had called for backup treat my wife with deference and respect. My wife didn't rush or raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply looked at the officers, gave them a small nod, and the two men immediately straightened their shoulders as though standing at attention. The silence stretched, uncomfortable and heavy, but my wife knew how to use silence as a weapon better than anyone. She let Karen stew in it, every second amplifying the weight of her mistake. Karen tried to recover, clearing her throat and forcing a strained smile, as if pretending she hadn't just made a fool of herself would somehow erase what everyone had witnessed. "Oh, you're the chief? Well, I didn't realize. I was just trying to make sure our community rules were being followed." Her words tumbled out clumsily, her confidence cracking with every syllable. She gestured toward the officers as though they might back her up, but neither man moved, their eyes trained firmly on my wife. My wife raised an eyebrow, not bothering to hide the faint smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. She didn't need to ask why the officers were there. She already knew. Instead, she turned her gaze toward Karen, the kind of steady, unblinking stare that stripped away all pretenses. Karen's voice faltered, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her bag as she stammered through a half-hearted explanation. "You see, the recycling bin was out overnight and, well, that's against HOA policy, and when I came to discuss it, she ignored me. I was concerned there might be an emergency, and I just thought—" She stopped herself, realizing how ridiculous it sounded when spoken aloud in front of uniformed officers. One of the officers shifted his weight, glancing briefly at Karen with an expression that said more than words ever could. He looked embarrassed for her, the way you might look at someone who had just tripped on a sidewalk but kept insisting they meant to do it. Karen noticed it too, and her cheeks flushed a deep shade of red. My wife finally spoke, her voice calm and even, but carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who had commanded entire precincts. "So, let me get this straight. You called my officers out here because I didn't answer the door." The way she phrased it wasn't a question. It was a statement laid bare in all its absurdity. Karen opened her mouth to reply, then closed it again, her throat tightening as she realized how impossible it was to justify. The neighbors had started to notice the commotion, curtains twitching and doors cracking open. People peeked out, watching from porches and windows, curious to see how this latest Karen episode was going to end. Karen, who thrived on being the center of attention, suddenly looked like she wanted to vanish. The last thing she had expected was to be the one on display, her credibility dissolving in real time under the gaze of the entire street. My wife didn't humiliate her outright. She didn't need to. The respect the officers showed her was enough to do the damage. Karen had built her power on the idea that no one could challenge her, that everyone had to comply with her demands, but in this moment, she was powerless. She wasn't the one in charge. She was just another neighbor with too much time on her hands and too little self-awareness to see how far she had overstepped. The officers, sensing the situation was more about ego than emergency, shifted their stance again, waiting quietly. They knew there wasn't a report to file or a violation to record. The only thing in danger here was Karen's pride. My wife didn't have to say much more. Her presence alone, standing calmly in the doorway while two officers deferred to her, spoke louder than any lecture could. Karen had called in the cavalry, only to realize they didn't ride for her. Every second Karen lingered there, the humiliation grew. The neighbors watching, the officers waiting, and my wife's unshakable composure all pressed down on her like a weight she couldn't carry. She tried to salvage what little dignity she had left, mumbling something about just trying to keep the neighborhood safe. But even she didn't sound convinced by her own words. The performance was over, and the audience had already seen the truth. The moment the officers shifted their focus entirely onto my wife, Karen's whole plan started collapsing. She had expected the scene to play out like one of her HOA meetings, where she could lecture without interruption and everyone else would nod along just to get her to stop. Instead, she was standing on the sidewalk, clutching her phone like a lifeline, while the very people she thought would enforce her stood silently waiting for cues from the woman she tried to get in trouble. The smug certainty she had arrived with was gone, replaced by a nervous fidgeting of her hands and a trembling in her voice she couldn't quite hide. My wife didn't rush to humiliate her. That wasn't her style. She simply stood there with the kind of quiet authority that needed no introduction. The badge at her side glinted softly in the morning light, a silent reminder that this wasn't some homeowner Karen could push around. She was in the presence of someone who actually held power, and suddenly, all of Karen's petty complaints about bins and door-knocking seemed laughably small. The officers, for their part, were careful to keep their expressions neutral, but the subtle shift in their posture spoke volumes. They weren't here to write up violations or scold a homeowner. They were here because their chief had been dragged into a ridiculous charade, and the last thing they wanted was to be complicit in Karen's little crusade. Karen tried to salvage her authority, forcing a polite smile that looked more like a grimace as she began rambling again. "You see, Chief, I was only trying to ensure the rules are followed. We have a community standard to uphold, and when people ignore it, well, it sets a bad example for everyone else." Her tone wavered halfway through, the confidence draining out of her as she realized how flimsy her argument sounded now that her audience wasn't a group of intimidated neighbors, but 2 trained officers and the woman they reported to. My wife let her finish, then calmly tilted her head, studying Karen with a look that was equal parts patient and piercing. She didn't need to raise her voice or deliver some fiery speech. The weight of her silence was enough. Karen shifted uncomfortably under that gaze, tugging at the hem of her shirt, her eyes darting around to see if anyone would back her up. But all she found were neighbors peeking through blinds or standing a safe distance away, watching the scene unfold like a live theater performance. The irony was that Karen had always built her power on fear. She counted on people being too polite, too conflict-averse, or too tired to stand up to her endless demands. She loved the control that came from sending out threatening emails or handing down citations no one dared contest. But in this moment, all of that false authority crumbled because she had finally run into someone who wasn't afraid of her, someone who commanded real respect rather than demanding it through intimidation. One of the officers shifted slightly and asked softly, "Chief, how would you like us to proceed?" The question landed like a thunderclap. It was subtle, polite, but its meaning was crystal clear. They were waiting for my wife to decide what happened next, not Karen. The way Karen's face drained of color was almost cinematic. She had called the cops to put my wife in her place, but now it was clear who actually held all the cards. Karen stammered something about not wanting to cause trouble, her voice a whisper compared to the bravado she'd walked in with. She gestured vaguely at the recycling bin at the curb as if that flimsy detail might justify everything. But even she seemed to know it was pointless. The officers didn't even bother looking at the bin. Their attention stayed firmly on my wife, as if Karen weren't even part of the conversation anymore. The neighbors, sensing the shift in power, began exchanging knowing glances. They had seen Karen throw her weight around for months, making life miserable for anyone who dared to live without bending to her every whim. Now, they were watching the one thing she had feared the most, her authority being stripped away in front of an audience she couldn't control. The whispers that had always stayed behind closed doors were now written in the expressions of every witness. Karen wasn't in charge anymore. My wife didn't need to issue any grand punishment. The damage had already been done. Karen's greatest weapon had always been the illusion of power, and in a single morning, that illusion had shattered. No amount of citations, complaints, or HOA speeches would ever carry the same weight again. Not after the neighborhood saw her standing small and stammering in front of the very officers she thought she controlled. The beauty of it was that my wife never once raised her voice, never once insulted her, never once had to flex her rank. She simply existed in her own authority, and it was enough to make Karen's empire of control crumble right there on the sidewalk. And though Karen tried to plaster on a fake smile as she mumbled something about just wanting the best for the neighborhood, everyone knew the truth. She hadn't been enforcing rules. She had been trying to enforce herself. And now everyone had seen just how powerless she really was. The entire neighborhood seemed to hold its breath as the weight of what had just happened sank in. Karen had strutted onto our porch certain she would prove once and for all that she was the one in control. But now she stood in the middle of the sidewalk, her phone hanging loosely in her hand, her face burning red while every pair of eyes in the neighborhood watched her unravel. The officers remained composed, their attention squarely on my wife, their posture making it clear where the true authority lay. The neighbors, who had endured years of Karen's lectures and constant surveillance, exchanged glances that said everything. They had just witnessed the moment the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA lost her crown. Karen tried to gather herself, smoothing down her shirt as though straightening the fabric could somehow piece together her shattered dignity. She forced a laugh that came out more like a cough, then waved her hand dismissively as if the whole situation had been a misunderstanding. "Well, I suppose this was all a little blown out of proportion," she said weakly, her voice shaking despite her attempt to sound casual. But the neighbors weren't buying it, and neither were the officers. My wife didn't respond, didn't have to. Her silence said more than any words could. A silence that stripped away Karen's facade, until nothing was left but the reality of her failed power trip. It wasn't just that Karen had been humiliated. It was that she had been exposed. For years she had operated under the belief that she held real authority, that her threats carried weight, that she could bend people to her will with citations and intimidation. But that illusion depended on everyone else playing along, and in one morning, the illusion had been shattered. The officers waiting for my wife's cue, the neighbors watching her crumble, the lack of anyone rushing to defend her. It all painted the same picture. Karen wasn't in charge. She never had been. The look in the neighbor's eyes told Karen everything she needed to know. The quiet tolerance she had relied on was gone. People weren't afraid of her anymore. If anything, they looked almost relieved, as though a burden they had silently carried for too long had finally been lifted. Karen's entire identity as the enforcer of the HOA had been built on intimidation, but intimidation only works if people believe in it. And after this, nobody believed anymore. One of the officers shifted slightly, giving Karen a polite nod that carried no real acknowledgement. It was the kind of gesture you give when you're ready to end a conversation without saying so. Karen picked up on it, her lips pressing into a thin line as she realized the show was over. She muttered something about needing to check on another issue down the street, though even she didn't sound convinced. Her voice trailed off as she turned, walking back toward her car with none of the swagger she had arrived with. The neighbors watched silently, some shaking their heads, others whispering to one another. The queen had been dethroned, and everyone had witnessed it. My wife remained calm on the porch, giving the officers a small nod before stepping back inside. She didn't need to gloat, didn't need to say a single word. The victory wasn't in rubbing it in. It was in the quiet certainty that Karen's grip over the neighborhood had finally been broken. The officers exchanged a brief glance, then gave a respectful nod before returning to their patrol car, leaving Karen to sit alone with the wreckage of her failed scheme. From that day forward, things were different. Karen still attended the HOA meetings, still sent out the occasional email about community standards, but her words no longer carried the same weight. The neighbors, who once feared her relentless watchfulness, now saw her for what she truly was, someone desperate for control, but powerless without their compliance. She had played her biggest card by calling the police, and it had backfired in the most spectacular way possible. And though Karen tried to pretend nothing had changed, everyone knew it had. The sideways glances at block parties, the whispered conversations she wasn't invited to join, the way people no longer scrambled to hide their trash bins or rush to answer her knocks. It all told the same story. The lesson had been learned, not just by Karen, but by the entire neighborhood. Intimidation only works until someone shows it for the hollow performance it really is.